Okay, so, you're out there, you love to like get into the core of ideas, right?
Yeah.
And you sent us down this really interesting path with Plato. His later work, we're talking Sophist and Statesman, these dialogues.
Yeah.
And it is so interesting how they kind of, they come after the Parmenides and all of the like, critiques of the theory of forms
Mm-hmm.
and they really do feel like they're from a different era in a lot of ways, and that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, right? This shift towards like more practical concerns and a new focus on method and metaphysics.
Exactly.
And so you want to be able to get through this stuff quickly, but you also want to get like a really thorough understanding, right? So
Yeah.
so we're going to be sort of surgically extracting like the most important insights from this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on these dialogues.
Mm.
And, our mission here is really straightforward. We want to like explore, these methods of inquiry that Plato's using, how he's asking questions, how he's trying to figure stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
And also how his ideas about like the nature of reality metaphysics, how that's kind of being, reshaped or updated in these later works.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think that one of the most important things to kind of notice right off the bat is that these dialogues really do come after, you know, Plato's self-critique in the Parmenides.
Right.
And we know that their later works, partially from that, but also from like the style, right? Like they're written in a similar style to the Laws, and we know that that's a later work. So
Gotcha.
so there's this like consistency, throughout Plato's later years.
Yeah. Okay. So let's break down, this shift in his thinking a little bit.
Okay.
It is pretty striking, how much the emphasis goes towards what the entry calls mundane and practical knowledge. And it really does feel like a bit of a departure from those earlier works that we were talking about, like the Phaedo or Republic. Like those were very much, in the realm of like these sort of eternal forms. And
Right.
and, this is very much like, how do we actually govern? How do we like understand,
Yeah.
rhetoric and...
Yeah. And the article even calls it down to earth and Aristotelian, which is kind of funny because
Yeah.
that's not really what we associate Plato with, right?
No, not the early Plato.
Not the early Plato.
Yeah,
no.
that. But I mean, when you think about it, it does kind of make sense, right? Like he's gone through this whole process of questioning and critiquing his own ideas, and now he's sort of turning his attention to, well, okay, how do we apply these ideas
Mm-hmm.
to the messy world that we live in?
Yeah, exactly. It's almost a natural progression.
Yeah.
You go through that rigorous self-examination,
Yeah.
and then you say, well, okay, let's see what these tools can actually do
Right.
out here in the world.
And a big part of that is his method, right? Like the way he goes about investigating these topics.
Right.
And in these dialogues in particular, the Sophist and Statesman, he uses this method of division and collection.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about like how that works? Because it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and it's kind of cool to see. The article describes it as like a tree-like system of roads.
Yeah.
And, the stranger is really explicit about saying, like, we're going to define, the sophist, we're going to define the statesman, we're going to define maybe the philosopher even.
Right.
And it seems like he's got a real procedure in mind, a real method.
Mm-hmm.
And so division, this idea of division, it's like starting with, a very broad category. So let's just say skill, right? Or art.
Okay.
And then you just keep breaking it down. You keep making these binary choices, right?
Yeah.
So is it this kind of skill or is it this kind of skill?
Right.
And you keep going down this branching path until you get to, the very end. You get to your quarry, as they call it. I see. Whether it's the sophist or the statesman.
So it's like a process of elimination almost.
Yeah.
You start with this big category and then you whittle it down
Yeah,
by making these choices.
exactly.
And then the definition that you end up with is really like the account of that journey, right? Like all of the...
It is. It's like a map of the route you took.
Right.
To get to that definition. It's not just the name, it's the whole process.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And they talk about this idea of collection as well, which kind of comes before the division.
Yeah, it's like a preliminary step.
Okay.
And it involves bringing together things that don't seem to belong together at first.
Yeah.
But, it's based on like our understanding of a name, right? So
Right.
let's say they give this great example in The Statesman where they talk about, the statesman and the king, and then even the slave master and the household manager.
Right. And at first you're like, well, what do those all have in common?
You think, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Right.
Then you realize that, okay, they all have this capacity to maintain their rule through the strength of their understanding.
Right.
And they're not relying on force so much.
Yeah, it's about like, using their knowledge
Mhm.
and their understanding to.
Exactly. And so that initial act of collection of like saying, okay, these things actually do share something,
Right.
even though these seem different,
Right.
that allows us to then start dividing.
I see. I
mean,
see.
we need to start with that shared, even though it might be kind of imprecise at first.
And this idea of collection isn't entirely new, right? Like they connect it back to the Phaedrus.
Yeah.
Which
Not brand new. It pops up,
Yeah.
in earlier dialogues, and in the Phaedrus specifically, they name it, right? They call it collection, and they really emphasize that it's important. It's a key part of dialectic.
Okay. So it's like a tool that he's had in his toolkit for a while, but it's really coming to the forefront
Yeah, exactly.
in these dialogues. Right.
Okay, and then there's this other idea of paradigms, which the article describes as like mundane examples,
Yeah.
right? So how does that work? Like, why is he...
I think part of what Plato is doing here is he's realizing that it's tough, right, to jump right into these complex philosophical questions.
Sure.
So what he does is he introduces this more familiar example, something we can all wrap our heads around.
Right.
Something every day, the paradigm, and it's got to share something fundamental with the concept they're really trying to investigate.
Okay.
So in the Sophist, it's the angler.
The angler.
Right? So we can all pretty easily understand what an angler is, a hunter who uses a certain technique with a hook
Right.
to catch fish. It's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward.
And so that nice, clear definition can then act as like a guide or a template when they go to define the sophist. Because remember, the sophist is also initially conceived as a type of hunter.
I see. So it's like using the familiar to explore the unfamiliar.
Exactly. It's like a philosophical analogy. Yeah, that's cool. But then, they run into some problems when they actually try to define the sophist.
Right.
Right. Like the article points out that the sophist's art doesn't really show up at like a single endpoint of the division.
Right.
Like the angler did.
Right. It's not nice and neat.
Right. And so what's going on there, is that like a failure of the method, or is it telling us something deeper?
I think it's telling us something much deeper.
Okay.
Because they actually come up with like 6 definitions for the sophist. And at first he's under this category of acquisitive art, right? So he's like a hunter of wealthy youths or a retailer of knowledge or selling arguments, all these different things.
Okay.
But then in this like really fascinating 6th attempt, he ends up under separative art.
Okay.
And get this, he's described as somebody who purifies souls of ignorance, which sounds a lot like Socrates.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's kind of a problem, right?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the name sophist could be applied to all sorts of different people.
Exactly. And that's kind of the point, right? It's not just about the name. It's about what's underneath it. And the stranger talks about this unhealthy appearance of manifold expertise.
Yeah, like the sophist seems to know a little bit about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Maybe not a lot about anything.
And the problem is that there's no like central feature to all these different types of learning, right?
So it's not just about like being knowledgeable in a lot of different areas. It's something else.
It's something else.
That's driving the whole thing.
Yeah, and what they eventually realize is that it's this idea of pretense, right?
Right.
The sophist appears wise.
But isn't actually wise.
But might not be wise.
Right. So those initial definitions, while they capture some of the activities of the sophist, they're missing this like core element of deception.
Exactly. And it's really through the failure to come up with one single definition like they did for the angler that they realize there's something more to this.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as we thought.
Yeah. Yeah, and that brings them to this really big metaphysical problem, right?
Right.
The problem of not being.
Yeah, huge problem.
Because if you're going to say that the sophist is dealing in falsehood, you have to be able to talk about what is false, what is not true. And that seems to run right up against this famous Parmenides idea that what is not cannot be.
Right. Parmenides laid down the law, and this is a big hurdle.
Yeah, that's a fundamental obstacle. So how do you even begin to approach that?
Well, they go through a bunch of these logical puzzles, right?
Okay.
That come from the assumption that, like, negation is just the opposite of something.
Okay.
And that there's this one-to-one relationship between names and things.
Okay.
And when you start talking about not being in that way, it leads to all kinds of contradictions.
Right, because if not being is just the opposite of being, then it's like absolute nothingness.
Right. It's like the void.
And how can you say anything about nothingness?
Right. How can you even talk about it?
Right. So Plato, through the stranger, needs to find a way to talk about not being without like falling into this
Right.
Parmenidean trap.
Exactly.
And this is where he introduces these great kinds, right?
Right.
Change, rest, sameness, and difference.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's his solution to this puzzle.
It's a brilliant move, honestly.
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying, look, these are the fundamental categories of reality.
Okay.
And they can interact with each other, they can blend, they can partake of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then he does this really clever thing. He reinterprets not being,
Okay.
not as the absolute opposite of being, but as difference.
Okay, so instead of saying that something is not, it just doesn't exist,
Right.
he's saying it's different.
It's different.
Okay.
Yeah, so when we say something is not large, we're not saying it's non-existent.
Mhm.
We're not even necessarily saying it's small.
Okay.
We're just saying that it's different from large within this category of size.
Right. So it's still a thing.
It's still a thing.
It just has a different property.
Exactly, and he uses this great example. He says, not large doesn't have to mean small.
Right.
It could just be something else.
Right, like a different color or...
Yeah, exactly, or a
form.
different shape.
Right.
And he introduces this idea of like an incompatibility range. So
Okay.
think about like the spectrum of hot and cold, right?
Mhm.
It's all temperature, but there's this range.
Right.
And then there's incompatibility sets. So like different shapes.
Okay.
They all belong to the category of shape, but they're compatible with each other.
Right.
You can't be a circle and a square at the same time.
Right. So he's basically saying that when you say something is not F, you're just saying that it has some other attribute
Mm-hmm.
that's different from F within that category.
Exactly.
Okay, and that allows him to talk about falsehood
Right.
without having to say that there's this realm of like non-existent things.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
found a way around the problem.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the Sophist. Now let's move on to the Statesman.
Okay.
And it seems like they're using a similar method of division to try to define the Statesman.
Mm-hmm.
But does it go as smoothly as it did with the Angler?
Not quite.
Okay.
It's a little messier.
Okay, what happened?
Well, so they start off with this collection, right? They're trying to group the statesman with the king.
Right.
And all these other kinds of rulers
Right.
based on this idea that they rule through understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But then when they start dividing, it gets really complicated.
Okay.
Like at first they divide knowledge into theoretical and practical,
Okay.
which seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But then as they go, they start associating the statesman with like directing,
Okay.
with generation, which is more practical,
Mm-hmm.
and then ultimately with hurting living beings.
Hurting living beings.
So it's like,
okay.
what happened to the distinction between theoretical and practical?
Right. And also, like, statesman is now being compared to a herdsman.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
That seems a little strange.
Yeah, it doesn't quite fit with our idea of what a statesman is.
No, it doesn't. Okay, so what's the issue there?
So there's this one point where young Socrates is like, okay, let's divide herding into human herding and non-human herding.
Okay.
And the stranger objects to this.
He does.
And he uses the example of barbarian as like a negative category.
Okay.
And he says, you can't define something based on what it's not.
Right.
It needs to have its own positive form.
Mm.
So barbarian is just like not a Greek speaker. It's not really a thing in itself.
Right.
And he gives another example of all numbers other than 10,000.
Yeah, that's not really a category.
It's just like everything that's not that one specific number.
Right, and so what he's saying is you need to divide through the middle
Exactly.
into parts that have their own form.
Like male and female or even an odd.
Okay, I get it. But then the article points out that the stranger's own divisions lead to this weird situation where the swineherd is like closer to the statesman than other kinds of herdsmen.
Yeah. It's kind of funny when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a little counterintuitive
It is.
from a political philosophy perspective.
But I think it's highlighting the limitations of just relying on this method
Yeah.
without really understanding what it is you're trying to define.
Mm-hmm.
The stranger actually says later on that the statesman has all these rivals,
Right.
like farmers and doctors and trainers
Right.
who also take care of human needs,
Mm-hmm.
unlike other herdsmen who are just focused on their flocks.
Right. So maybe young Socrates was onto something with his human versus non-human division?
Maybe he was.
Okay.
And the article even says that it aligns with the Sophists' idea of names coming from objects
Right.
and negation being about complements.
So maybe he wasn't totally off
It
base.
seems like his mistake was focusing on the objects like the people
Right.
instead of the art itself.
Right, the way they're being cared for.
Exactly. And it's almost like the Stranger's lecture on parts and kinds is this way of guiding young Socrates towards that realization. And even the inconsistencies in the Stranger's own divisions between the Sophist and the Statesman suggest that the method is flexible.
Right.
You know, it depends on what you're investigating.
Right, right. So to get a better handle on the statesman's art, they shift to this paradigm of weaving.
Right.
Okay, so how does that help?
Well, weaving is all about combining things, right?
Okay.
So it's like the Statesman is combining theoretical and practical knowledge
Okay.
and all these different activities within the community.
Right, right. Like weaving together different threads to make a whole cloth.
Exactly. And at first they try to define weaving as just the art of clothes.
Okay.
But that's too broad,
Too broad.
just like their initial attempts to define the Statesman.
Right.
So they have to get more specific.
Okay.
And they do this by using what the article calls division by limbs.
The division by limbs.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're looking at all these different arts that are related to weaving,
Okay.
like carding and spinning.
Mm.
And they're distinguishing them based on how they contribute to the final product, which is clothing.
Okay.
And all these related arts, they're called helping causes.
Helping causes.
Yeah, or sunosiai in Greek.
Okay.
And they're providing the tools and materials.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this really nice analogy for how the statesman oversees and coordinates all these specialized skills
Within the state.
within the state.
Okay.
Exactly.
That makes a lot more sense than some of those awkward divisions.
It does.
Yeah, it really highlights this idea of integration and management, like skillful manager.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about method a lot.
Yeah.
Let's talk about metaphysics and dialectic a little bit.
Okay.
Because the article, it starts off by mentioning the Parmenides.
Right.
And all those questions about forms and participation.
Mm-hmm.
So how do the Sophists and Statesmen kind of deal with that legacy?
Well, one of the most important things, I think, is that they show us that dialectic is still possible, even after all those criticisms in the Parmenides.
Right.
Like in the Statesman, they explicitly say that we're doing this to get better at dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still a crucial tool. And while they use division a lot, it's not the only method.
Right, they're using all sorts of different techniques.
Yeah, they're adapting their methods to the subject matter.
Right, right.
Now, with the forms, it gets a little tricky.
Okay.
Because while they're searching for the essence of things like the Sophist and the Statesman, it's not really clear if those are separate forms in the same way that we see in the earlier dialogues.
Okay.
Like the stranger mentions these immaterial things that are revealed by logos. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're full-blown forms.
Right.
And it's interesting that separate forms are mostly absent from these dialogues, except for that one section in the Sophist, the Battle of Gods and Giants.
Okay.
Which seems to be addressing some very specific metaphysical debates from that time.
Right, right. And then the article brings up this question of forms of negations.
Yes. Like not large or not beautiful.
Right.
And also the fact that the stranger rejects forms for things that are defined negatively, like barbarian.
Yeah.
So it seems like Plato's thinking about forms might be changing.
It really does. And the Sophist even talks about the form of not being.
Right.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, so maybe he's found a way to make sense of those negations.
Maybe.
But then the rejection of forms for things like barbarian seems to suggest that maybe not everything has a form.
Right. Maybe it's not a one-to-one correspondence.
Right, right. Maybe it's more about like fundamental features or structures that explain things.
And it seems like the great kinds, those are really important.
Right. Being change all those.
Yeah, they seem to be like the underlying structure for all the other kinds. And the point of dialectic is to figure out how all that fits together.
So for you, the philosopher listening out there, the key takeaways here are that Plato is really refining his methods in these dialogues.
He's grappling with some really tough questions about definition.
Yeah.
He's rethinking the idea of not being.
Yeah.
And it seems like his whole view of metaphysics and dialectic is evolving.
It does.
And it leaves us with this really interesting question to think about.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, given how much Plato struggled to define these concepts,
Right.
like the Sophist and the Statesman, and how he had to revise these fundamental ideas about being and not being,
Yeah.
what does that tell us about how hard it is to really pin down these abstract ideas,
Right.
even when you're using these really rigorous philosophical methods?
I think that's something worth pondering.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. Well, we encourage you to go check out the Sophist and the Statesman for yourself.
Right.
Use what we've talked about today as a starting point.
Yeah. As a springboard for your own exploration.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.